So hello students, in our continuing series on figures of speech, we will take up two more figure of speeches today. Before that, let us know what these figures of speech are once again. Now, figures of speech are literary devices that are used mainly in any form of literature or poetry as well. So we call these figures of speech as poetic devices or literary devices, which makes reading a big pleasure, and it keeps the reader captivated and engaged by the use of words through these figures of speech. Now today basically we will look at two figures of speech. One is alliteration and the other is repetition. The last lecture we dealt with simile and metaphor, and to a great extent we were successful in clearing the doubts which always occurs while recognizing similes and metaphors. So today we will take up alliteration and repetition. There is even some confusion in students recognizing and differentiating between these two figures of speech, because there is some type of repetition or the other. Students get confused, but today we will clear that confusion too. So let's look at what is alliteration, right? Now, alliteration is a figure of speech in which the sound of the word is repeated. A sound is repeated at the beginning of the word. Okay, so I said is that what is alliteration? Alliteration is a poetic device or a figure of speech wherein the sound is repeated at the beginning of a word in the same line. So we'll have a look at around 5 examples of alliteration and see how sounds are repeated. We'll take examples of them which will make you understand better. After that, we will take up another 5 examples of repetition, right? So what is alliteration? Alliteration is a poetic device or a literary device. We call it as a figure of speech in which the sound is repeated at the beginning of a word, right? So let's have a look at it right away. So students, here I told you figures of speech are also known as poetic or literary devices. Now alliteration, as I mentioned, is a figure of speech in which there is the use of the same sound at the beginning of the word. So here you have 5 examples. Let's take them one by one. The first is from the first poem itself, where the mind is without fear. So where the mind is without fear and the head is held high. So students, you can see over here the sound of her is repeated, head is held, head held her. The sound of the word her is repeated at the beginning of these words, head and held. That's why we call this as alliteration. So it's a very good example of alliteration where the sound of her is repeated in the beginning of head and held. Second one, into the dreary desert of dead habit. Desert and dead habit, the sound of d is repeated at the beginning of the word desert, dead, right? So you can see the sound is repeated. That's why alliteration. Then you have jealous in honor, sudden and quick in quarrel. In this line also you can see the sound of quick in quarrel, quick in quarrel, right? Qu is repeated, the sound of qu is repeated. That's why it is alliteration. Then the fourth one, not one is dissatisfied not one is demented. So you can hear the sound D, dissatisfied and demented. Again, a very good example of alliteration. Let us have a look at the fifth example. This is from the poem Puli, I believe. Yeah, it's from the poem Puli. Let him keep the rest, but keep them with repining restlessness. See how beautifully the figure of speech alliteration has been used over here. Let him keep the rest. I hope you know in this poem he was talking about God withholding the quality of rest and bestowing man with all other qualities except with the quality of rest, so that human beings turn to him and do not forget him, right? So here he says is that let him keep the rest and keep them with repining restlessness. So the sound of repining restlessness, the sound of re is repeated, r is repeated very often. So repining restlessness. You can see how the sound is repeated. That makes it a very good example of alliteration. Now students, we look at repetition in the next examples. Here students, we'll have a look at some examples of repetition. The big difference between alliteration and repetition. In alliteration, a sound is repeated at the beginning of a word, whereas repetition is a poetic device in which the word itself is repeated, right? So that's the big difference between repetition and alliteration. So let us have a look at a few examples of repetition, and that should clear your confusion between alliteration and repetition, right? So here you have examples of the figure of speech, that is repetition, right? So let's have a look. Repetition is a poetic device where words are repeated. We have the examples, 3 examples here. The first one being from the poem Puli. And rest in nature, not the God of nature. So here you can very clearly see the word nature is repeated over here. You all must be knowing what he meant by this line, that if God gives man all the qualities, he will enjoy nature, but he will not think about the creator of nature, that is the God of nature, right? That is what actually this line means. But how beautifully he has used these words and repeated these words for good poetic effect. That's why the figure of speech used is repetition. And rest in nature, not the God of nature. So the words nature have been repeated for a very good poetic effect. And I stand and look at them long and long. This line you would have come across in the poem Animals, where he says that animals have excellent virtues and therefore he would stand and look at them for a long time. So the words used long and long. So the word long is repeated for poetic effect in this line. I stand and look at them long and long, right? So this is repetition. The words long and long are repeated. We have a look at this one from the same poem. Not one is dissatisfied, not one is demented. If you look at this, this is also an example of alliteration because the sound of D is repeated over here. But besides that, this is a very good example of repetition. In fact, 2 pairs of words are repeated. Not, again here you have not, right? So this is a very good example. So this is one example. Not one is dissatisfied, not one is demented. So the word not is repeated over here, and therefore the figure of speech is repetition, right? So students, wherever the words are repeated, the figure of speech or the poetic device used is said to be repetition. So students, I hope you understood the big difference between alliteration and repetition. We will be giving you some assignments on similes, metaphor, alliteration. Please work on those assignments so that your understanding and grasping of these figures of speech will be perfect. Our aim is to see that you practice as much as figures of speech possible so that you get a good understanding of them. In your poetry, during the last lecture, I had in fact stressed upon this. There are totally 8 poems in your English portion or syllabus, and in these 8 poems totally you will be having a variety of 18 figures of speech. So we have taken up 4 in these 2 sessions: simile, then metaphor, today alliteration and repetition. We will take up 2 more figures of speech in the next. In this way, slowly we will cover up those 18 figures of speech, by which time you should be now perfect, right? So students, take care, stay safe, and thank you all of you.